Today we're going to talk about how we enter an academic conversation and what that looks like for us. We definitely have a difficult time, I think, approaching text because we feel like we don't know what they mean, and we go to Google and we look it up and we have someone else tell us what they mean. But I want you to exercise those skills yourself this semester, and especially in this assignment. Having an original idea about a text can be very daunting, right? Especially if the if the text is very old, like Shakespeare, for instance, or Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, which we'll talk about in class. But I taught Shakespeare last spring, and my students were able to come up with unique and interesting and original ideas, even about Shakespeare, which has been around for so long. But how do we do that? We start with observation, and that's our first step. When you really immerse yourself in a text, you begin to engage with it on different levels. So maybe you are one of those super fans who loves Hamilton, right? And it just came out on Disney+, and maybe you've watched it more than once. Maybe you've watched it more than 5 times. And you'll notice that the more that you watch something, whether it's Hamilton or Fast and Furious 7, you begin to notice more and more things about that particular text. And it's the same goes with your favorite book that you've read. Maybe you've read Lord of the Rings 100 times. You begin to notice things. And that's that observational quality that we want to do. And you know, because if you've watched something over and over again or read something over and over again, that it takes time. So observation and categorization are the first 2 steps to having an original idea, but they take some time. You can't just read something once and imagine that you're going to have an amazing thesis that comes out of it. So we spend a lot of time on those first 2 pillars, observe and categorize, before we can get to having an original idea. Observation is my favorite part. It's so pleasurable, right? You just spend time with whatever it is, the text, the museum exhibit, the movie, the poem. You interact with it, the context, the subtext. You get to know more about it. You annotate, underline all those repetitions and those things that stick out to you as important. You also pay attention to what's not there. So if you're going to go back to the Hamilton example, one of the things that you might notice that is not in Hamilton are any main actors who are white. That's important, and it would probably contribute to a thesis that would be an original idea. Maybe not now, but when it first came out, certainly that would have been an original observation. You want to look for connections with other texts, and that's one way in to an original thesis, is putting things in conversation. So I'm going to read a Shakespeare text, and I'm going to listen to a Kanye song, and I'm going to talk about them together. It can be done. So you have to think about the way that you are moving through the world, and you want to put that into play with your observation, and that's important. So using a lens is also important, but maybe not for everyone. It would be something like a Marxist or a historicist or a feminist lens that would help you interpret something. We'll talk more about that if you're interested, but it is there. It is a possibility. All right. Once you come up with some observations, you may have 50 observations about your text. You're not going to use all of those observations. They're not all going to be useful to you as you make meaning. Some are just interesting things. But then learning to discern what's important and what's not important is very helpful. And we make categories to isolate the relationships within the text or between texts. And that's really important because those relationships are going to be very rich as we begin to make meaning. But that can help us even think about how we want to approach the structure of an argument as well, by thinking about the different categories into which our observations fall. So if we go back to Hamilton, the idea that there are certain non-spoken things that happen on stage, a lot of stage business. There might be a lot of observations about that stage business that fall in that particular category, and that could help us make an interesting observational thesis about that particular work. So the last step is to make meaning. You have to go back to your observations and the categories that they fall into. You have to think to yourself, okay, I think I've got something important here. But now you have to go do some contextual research and some critical research. That means journals and other scholars and people who know a lot about this topic. And you have to have an original idea. And the text has to support your theory. So I had a student once want to write an essay about the Scarlet Letter, and it involved aliens. Well, there are no aliens in the text, and he wanted there to be aliens, but there really aren't any aliens. So you have to be really careful with the text, and that's an egregious example, but it happens. Sometimes people want to make read texts as Christian that are not Christian. Sometimes people want to make something symbolic that's not symbolic. So that's why the observational step is so important, because the more time you spend with a text, the more you can test the validity of your observations and see whether or not you're correct. And then any meaning that you make of the text shouldn't just be frivolous. It should deepen not only your understanding of the text, but my understanding of the text. I should walk away thinking, not only do I understand that better, I actually have a better interaction with the text now, and it helps me understand something else better. So it's really helpful. You have to think about your interactions with materials like movies and texts and poems, and even eventually situations and things that we want to analyze closely as a conversation. So when we talk about it being original, it doesn't have to reinvent the wheel, but it does need to bring something new to the conversation. If you meet someone for the first time and you simply repeat everything they say, they're not going to want to talk to you very much anymore. So this is really when we think about conversation, all of the things that make conversation good among people makes conversation good in the academic sense. And that's one of the things that we'll be working on a lot. So we also want to think about different kinds of texts. I know that everybody's read a poem and everybody's read a book and everybody's watched a movie. But I want to open this assignment up to all kinds of interesting texts, and we call those atypical texts. You do those exactly the same way that you do other texts, but here's an example. This is a bulletin board that I found in the Clark Education Wing on Milligan's campus, and clearly someone was assigned to do a Milligan Pride, some sort of school spirit bulletin board. But you see at the very top here we have athletics, and then we have more athletics, and then we have this person I think is an athlete or a musician, I can't tell. And we have lots of buffaloes, so lots of school pride, a lot of things here, but we don't have a lot of focus on academics. We also don't have a lot of focus on the arts. So if we're talking about what's there and what's not there, we have to suggest something is interesting about this particular representation of Milligan's identity. Now, this is one bulletin board in one wing of one building on Milligan's campus. So we can't overgeneralize and say anything particular about Milligan as a whole, perhaps, but we might be able to come up with an understanding of how Milligan's perceived by students who would be creating such a board. And in a little while, we'll have some model thesis statements in the Analyzing Nonfiction presentation that I'll have for you in a little while. So, but students, we did this last year, and a lot of students were able to come up with an observation and then a category and then a thesis where they made meaning out of this particular bulletin board. You can get up close a little bit and see it a little bit closer if you want to spend some more time with your observations. And remember, that's really the most important step. You don't want to just cursorily look at something. You want to spend a lot of time with those observations. And when people tell me they don't have anything to write about or they don't know what to say, I oftentimes look at their list of annotations, and it is woefully inadequate. So I would like you to have as many observations as you possibly can in order to be prepared to move to that next step. All right, so that is the end of our introduction into having a conversation, entering the academic conversation, and I look forward to entering that conversation with you.